The rise of the bear dogs came off the back of a long string of prehistoric predators that stood their ground for almost 50 million years after the collapse of the dinosaur empire. But this was more than just a new generation, it was our generation. Bear dogs were true carnivorans, members of the same order as most of our dominant mammalian predators today. And they were the earliest of their kind to get huge. And Ammitocyon was a prime example. Ammitocyon was also one of the last of the bear dogs, representing a final push in carnivore evolution and a powerful farewell to the bear dog line, and it set the stage for both bears and dogs. In this video, we're looking at the rise of Ammitocyon as the last of the bear dogs. We're looking at how it got there in the first place, what made it so formidable, and why, after a relatively brief reign, its demise would spell the end of the Amphicyon rule. And stick around to find out what this unusual bear dog has in common with some ancient Greek mythological beings. First, let's look at the family itself. We've talked a bit already about the bear dogs as a whole in a previous video, so we'll keep this a bit brief, but it's worth noting a bit of context to set Ammitocyon up with. While carnivorans have been around for almost as long as their extinct rivals, until the Miocene they'd been kept down by the dominant groups of Paleogene mammalian predators, including the enormous hyenodonts who'd taken all the larger spots and were incredibly diverse in their own right. Also the cat-like Ravageds who were doing cat-like things before cats existed. And then the more generalist entelodonts who likely filled up more generalized niches between the two hypercarnivorous hunting groups on either side of them. But by the late Miocene, all of these groups had run their course, and were almost entirely extinct, but for a few straggling hyenodonts holding out that long. In their place, though, were the rising stars, carnivoran predators, more generalized, more adaptable, and more diverse than their predecessors, and they were ready to take advantage of a rapidly changing climate. These would ultimately become the majority of mammalian carnivores that we're familiar with today, including bears, wolves, cats, mustelids, seals, and others. As mentioned, these guys had been around for a while, but they'd never been offered the chance at dominance, and this would change with the rise of the Amphicyonids, or bear dogs. During this rise, they would cover all continents of the northern hemisphere, ranging in size from small fox-like animals to wolf-like pursuit predators, and up as much as, we'll soon see, as the significantly larger variants, producing some brutish ambush predators too. And the largest of these would become the first carnivorans to have a go at becoming massive, essentially becoming the first dominant super-predators of the order. Bear dogs fell across a spectrum. Some were more bear than dog, others were more dog than bear. The latter would occupy the cursorial pursuit predator niches, and the bear dogs with more bear in them would ambush and bring down larger prey by force. The bear approach came in a bit later and stemmed from a more dog-like predecessor, and these would evolve to fit the dense forests that were spreading across the planet, especially in Eurasia. As the Miocene progressed, the ambush hunters arose, improving in grappling ability, size, and dexterity. This came at the cost of running ability, and like modern bears, these brutes walked on the soles of their feet rather than on their toes the way dog-like versions would. And as soon as they started to evolve in this direction, they also got big. All this began in the early Miocene, peaking around the middle, and creating two well-known monster examples like Amphicyon ingens and Amphicyon giganteus, from North America and Eurasia respectively. Both of these animals may have exceeded 500 kilograms in weight, and they ruled the top spots for millions of years. But like the dominant predators that passed Amphicyonidae its crown, this family in turn would ultimately give way to the next generation of predators. Before they did, though, they produced one final hurrah. Around the time of the Amphicyon decline came a genus that would come to represent the pinnacle of bear dog brutality, Ammitocyon. The ancient Egyptians compiled written spells to help their dead navigate the underworld after funerals. This, now called Book of the Dead, contains information on a monstrous amalgamation of the three most lethal animals known to people at the time: a lion, a hippo, and a crocodile. This monster, called Ammit the Devourer, was actually some sort of guardian demon goddess of sorts, enrolled with the dark task of devouring the spirits of the dead whose hearts hadn't passed the purity test, which would be held in the afterlife. After death, deities would weigh the deceased's heart against the feather of Mut, and if it was lighter, the soul was deemed pure, and it would be allowed to pass on to immortality. If it wasn't, well, that's what Ammit was for. She's often depicted crouched at the ceremony, ready to bite into any heart that doesn't fail the test. So when in 2021 in Madrid, 3 specimens of one of the most specialized hypercarnivorous and bear-like of all of the bear dogs was found in the late Miocene sediment, it was aptly named after Ammit. Ammitocyon roamed around 9 million years ago in what is now Spain, and it would have been one of, if not the most powerful and formidable predators in Eurasia at the time. While it followed the trend of its bear-like ancestors, Ammitocyon took some steps further, perhaps becoming the strongest that the bear dogs would ever be. It was almost a meter tall, over 2.5 meters long, and significantly heavier than male African lion, up to perhaps 300 kilograms. If you'll remember the aforementioned Amphicyon genus, you'll know that Ammitocyon was only about 60% of this mass, but what stands out about their genus was how robust the skeleton was. This predator weighed around the same as a grizzly bear, and sported the strongest forelimbs of any member of the bear dogs known. And from the ratios of bone sizes in its arms, researchers concluded that it would have had at least as much, if not more power in its arms than a saber-toothed tiger or a large bear. But the back end was just as formidable. Its rear limbs were thick and dense, and its flat-footed stance would have allowed it bursts of speed and impressive stability while tackling large prey. On top of these features, the skull, already huge, sports an equally exaggerated sagittal crest. This sail-shaped protrusion on the top of the skull is where many animals get their bite force from, as it provides wide contact surface for the massive temporalis muscles. When biting down hard, you need the corresponding teeth to do the damage, and Ammitocyon had that in droves. This beast had thick, deep-rooted canines that were well-founded in its massive jaw. It also had evolved reduced dentition, keeping only the most cutting of the carnassials, and losing anything else that was more generalized or used for other feeding techniques like bone crushing. As such, its skull wasn't as strong against the up and down bite motion, but it was far more reinforced against side-to-side motion, pointing to a bite-and-hold style of killing, and a beast ready to restrain an enormous struggling herbivore. So Ammitocyon was a brute force hunter, especially well adapted for eating flesh and really nothing much else at all. More specialized in this way then than any of the other bear dogs yet discovered. And looking at where it lived, it's hardly surprising that this level of brutality was needed. In what is now Spain at the time of Amitocyon's reign, the lands were sprawling with giraffids, elephants, rhinos, and even horses, the last of which appears from isotopic analyses to have been high on the meal priority for Ammitocyon. And the sheer wealth of these animals wandering around at the time would have made the sit-and-wait strategy of ambush predator the most sensible option. But by the time of Ammitocyon, bear dogs were already in decline, and even this monster apex predator would soon have to give way to the next generation of carnivorans on the horizon. Bear dogs jumped in to fill the vacant niches once occupied by the Oligocene predators, but they were essentially the pioneer families of the carnivoran order, and would ultimately be replaced by even more effective members of that order. They weren't alone in this. Other incredible examples include wolf-sized honey badgers like Eomelivora, and a prehistoric hypercarnivorous red panda analogue called Simocyon. But neither of these were likely to have provided any direct competition to Ammitocyon. It may even have been another bear dog that tipped the scales for this meat specialist. Spain was home to another huge amphicyon called Machairodus, and this one had teeth that were capable of crushing bone as well, which may have given it a competitive edge over the more specialized teeth of Ammitocyon, which, as we described, were purely for cutting meat. But it's unlikely that even this beast would have toppled the reigning bear dog of late Miocene Spain, who was at least 20% larger and hunted in slightly different environments. Instead, there was a rising clade of carnivorans, whose ferocity, flexibility, and adaptable natures would eventually prove to be a winning combination that still exists today. The cats. A wave of felid predators appears in the fossil record around the time of the last bear dogs. These would be the cousins of the infamous saber-tooths that would hold the fort until the end of the Pleistocene. One of the largest, and therefore most likely to have competed with Ammitocyon, was Machairodus. a 250 kilogram example with a very different hunting style for the same horse-based prey. But this alone may not have been enough. Machairodus had a more generalized predatory diet than Ammitocyon. And finally, we may have reached the real reason that the last of the bear dogs eventually disappeared. An extremely specialized hunter. Ammitocyon perhaps couldn't adapt away from what it was specifically built for, and as the late Miocene brought with it significant changes in environments, this restricted lifestyle simply couldn't provide enough in terms of survival for the bear dog lineage. Much in the way the highly specialized hyenodonts had failed to adapt in time to compete with the rise of Amphicyonids, Amphicyonids too had now become so specialized in their roles that it would end up working against them in the face of new, more flexible competition. And so the reign of the big cats began, and if you'd like to see what a mess they made of Pleistocene megafauna in North America, check out our video on that one after this. Meanwhile, before we end this one, we wanted to touch on a neat little parallel between Ammitocyon and a class of mythical Greek beasts. Just before we do though, thanks so much for watching, and if you've enjoyed this video, please give it a like to feed the algorithm and get it to more people. And if you haven't already, consider adding your subscription to the channel to see more in the coming weeks. Greek mythology talks of a monstrous, fire-breathing beast made up of various different parts. Often it has the head of a lion, sometimes also a goat, and a snake for a tail. Some depictions give it wings and other classically demonic appendages like horns. This mixture of frightening animal components is called a chimera, and in the loose sense it's also what Ammit was in Egyptian mythology. This alone is enough to draw a comparison, but perhaps even more interesting is that the fossil remains of Ammitocyon come not from a single sample, but from a mixture of 3 different individuals. And in paleontology, this use of several individuals to piece together a single image of a specimen is known as a chimera. So the word chimera to describe Ammitocyon is appropriate in more ways than one, and in common language a chimera can also be used to describe something that is implausible, surprising, and perhaps touching on the legendary. And in those contexts, few animals fit the description more than the last of the bear dogs, Ammitocyon. And that's all for this one. Thanks again for watching. Leave your comments below if you'd like us to cover anything that we haven't already, and see you next time.